And there's a big trend in the food industry that's been going on for a while to, instead of just using a gas chemical flame to cook food, they'll actually have real wood fires that they cook over in some high-end restaurants.
Hello, future Foodcast food enthusiasts. We're so glad that you've tuned in with us today for this episode of the Future Foodcast. I'm Pam Leinmiller, and I am your host for today. And I am so excited to have Chris Harrigan here with me and hear about what he has going on with his business. It's really interesting. First of all, welcome to the Foodcast, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We're glad you're here. Can you tell us a little bit about what your business is?
And it's you age it. So in the same way that you would age wine, spirits, or olive oil in a wooden barrel. So instead of putting the liquid inside the wood, with my product, you put the wood into the liquid. Since this isn't 1500 or we don't need wooden barrels for containers anymore, you can use stainless steel or anything like that. And through practices and stuff, I can actually get the same or better results than a barrel at much lower cost.
Okay, so you've taken what used to happen and still does happen for aging in barrels. Normally you would put the liquid in a barrel and age it that way. You've actually got the wooden staves that you put into the liquid instead. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And tell us how you came about even thinking about this concept. It's really innovative. I love it. I love the idea.
Thank you. When I was in grad school getting my MBA at Clemson, the bourbon industry hit what you would call a boom. The best bourbon takes about 8 years to produce. And at the time, the demand for bourbon went through the roof. I don't know the exact percentage, but I know the end result was that you can go to any special release, like any high-end bourbon, there's going to be a line out the door, or they have to do a lottery system to be able to deal with the demand. And then the people that are lucky enough to buy it can sometimes resell it on the internet, on the black market, for about 10 times the price they paid retail. If that gives you any kind of a gauge as to how much of a boom there is in the bourbon industry right now.
I was not aware that is quite a boon in the bourbon industry. So that was kind of the impetus for you, probably like bourbon. In addition to that, I guess you have you're a customer.
I started trying to figure out ways to take average bourbon and make it better. And through lots and lots of trial and error, which eventually developed into me blind A/B testing it on local mixologists who had really good palates. I eventually developed a product while I was in grad school that people would be willing to pay money for, and I launched it into a business.
The entrepreneurial journey, Chris, that is really great. So can you explain to our audience what that A/B testing, what does that mean? What did you do when you were in grad school?
So first, I tried to figure out as many different variables as possible that could potentially affect the outcome, because my first experiments ended horribly. It was way worse than the bourbon I started with. So I started trying to identify as many variables as possible. And then I would do either, so let's say side grain versus end grain. Side grain is what you see if you split a tree in half. You have equal halves on each side. End grain is what you would see if you chop down the tree and you see the rings on the bottom. So on that part of it, I would do like one bottle modified with mostly side grain and one bottle modified with mostly end grain. And then I would do a blind A/B test on somebody and they would pick which one they liked the best. So kind of iterative things like that. And then at various steps along the way, I would combine everything I had learned so far and test unmodified versus modified to make sure I was going in the same right direction at least.
Wow. So really you failed your way to success in a in a way.
Yeah.
You just tried, and then the whole idea of the A/B testing, that blind test, is you have two different options and they either choose option A or option B was better. And then you go with the better one and try to even improve on that. So you were using an iterative process to further what you're doing. So what kind of materials do you use as your source materials? Like, how did you decide what material you use?
Well, oak was the most obvious because that's what the bourbon and basically the vast majority of the alcohol industry uses to age spirits or olive oil or anything like that. So I started with American white oak and branched out into French oak. The first time I really went outside of the standard woods was when I started using wood from a cherry tree. So there are food grade French oak and American white oak supply chains that exist already that I was able to pull from. but there's no such thing for cherry that I knew of.
Let's say that sentence again. So pause for a second, and you can start in with the sources of the white oak and the French oak.
So there are existing food grade supply chains for both French oak and American white oak. And so I was able to pull material from those supply chains. When I first started going outside of the norm, I basically had to develop the supply chain completely myself for wood from a cherry tree, which means I have to get the wood the second it leaves the sawmill, and I control it from every moment from that point forward outside of like one manufacturing step. So I basically had to develop my own supply chain for food grade wood from a cherry tree.
Oh my goodness. I don't even know where you start to develop your own supply chain. Supply chain is a hot topic right now, Chris. I'm sure you're aware. Why did you decide to go outside of the traditional oak? Just for experimentation, or were you having trouble finding it?
Well, it's more for experimentation. One cool, interesting fact that I learned during this whole iterative process is the reason that they use oak for barrels is because it's a watertight wood. It's the same reason that they make ships out of wood, or at least they used to for the most part. If you made like the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria out of wood from a like apple tree or something, it may only make it a quarter of the way across the ocean because it's not a watertight wood. Since I was using wood in a way that didn't require me to contain liquid, it really opened up the door to use basically any wood. And so my first choice was wood from a cherry tree.
I love that cherry flavor, and I bet that is really great. So you did that with your bourbon?
Yeah.
Far as experimentation.
Yeah,
And
it tastes like wood, but what I found with any tree, especially ones that bear a fruit, is the flavor is definitely wood, but it hints at the fruit that it produces, which makes sense because for anything to be produced from the tree, all the sap, nutrients, and everything has to come up and through the tree and out into the fruit itself.
And I think that's really cool that you looked outside of the traditional wood that was being used there, and just sourcing your product. So talk to me about because I know with the barrels, there's aging that happens there, and you had to take a deep dive into all of that, like the technical part of that, I think, for what you were doing.
So the two biggest things that people talk about when you talk about with barrel aging are oxidation and the expansion and contraction of the barrel. I talked to a couple different scientists, and most of the oxidative processes that actually happen very quickly within a matter of weeks, if not just a few months at most. And that's from, the air slowly seeping in and out of the barrel. So the same thing actually can happen with any kind of a vessel. So you can have a stainless steel vessel with wood in it, and unless you completely seal out all air from that container, you still got oxygen exposure and thus the oxidation process. In liquid, the molecules are moving all around, so it's not like some liquid at the bottom never sees the air. The other thing that happens is that people talk about the expansion and contraction with temperature changes, at least in the bourbon world. In the wine world, they specifically have barrels in caves that almost never change temperature, and aging still happens there. So the expansion and the contraction from the heating and the cooling throughout the seasons and night and day basically accelerates the process that's naturally happening, because the liquid molecules are going to go, they're moving all over the place. They're going to go into and out of the wood, but the expansion and the contraction speeds that up. When you've got a container and the wood inside of it, it's not like the liquid is like a Star Wars force power, like pushing out on the wood. Overall, it kind of does, but you got each individual molecule bouncing off of each other, and the force that they're generating is perfectly omnidirectional. So anything within that container where there's liquid pushing out on the wood and the wood pushing out on the liquid feels the exact same pressure that any wood on the outside would feel. So you've got the exact same processes going on, whether the wood is on the outside of the vessel or there's like a different vessel and the wood is on the inside.
Okay. And hence the ability for you to put the stave and affect the product.
Yeah, and it depends if you define aging as like with a barrel, where a barrel is the only thing that matters, then technically it wouldn't be aging. But if you define aging as any or all of the necessary processes taking place, then staves do all of that.
And that's one of the advantages of your product, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about some of the other advantages. I know there's, in the barrels, there's different kinds of wood that they use as far as how that's finished, here in the States versus internationally, or how they used to do it versus now. I can't remember the detail of what you told me.
Yeah. So in America, we kiln dry all our wood, which basically zaps the wood. It's not a microwave, but it gets all the moisture out very quickly. And in the old world barrel producers, for the most part, they don't kiln dry the wood. And I figured out very early on that kiln drying the wood, whatever quality flavor wise of wood that you start with, if you kiln dry the wood, it roughly cuts the flavor quality in half. One of the reasons that they do that in America is one for sterility purposes, because in a barrel, they typically toast it from the inside after it's already formed. And so you've got creases and stuff like that where liquid could get into that may not meet the sterilization standards that the surface area on the inside of the barrel may touch. But if you kiln dry it beforehand, you don't have to worry about that.
Okay, and kiln dry, that was the term I was trying to remember about that, because I think that sterilization, I think that's probably pretty important to a consumer.
Yeah, so with staves, the other benefit is that when they are heat treated, I far exceed, or any stave producer that knows what they're doing, far exceeds the sterilization standards for any kind of wood or food product during the heat treating process. In every single part of the surface area, it all receives enough heat to be sterilized. So that's not really a factor anymore. So you don't need to kiln dry it. And also the other reason they kiln dry it is because the wood's a little bit more stable without having to let it age longer outside. So it's easier to make a non-leaking barrel, but when you don't have to worry about the barrel holding the liquid anymore, that's no longer an issue.
Right. Now, you talked about any stave producer. You have competitors in this space, obviously, but I know that from the beginning, you were not only focused on the flavor that you were producing, but also the quality of the product that you were producing and what you were using for your staves. Do you want to tell us about that a little bit?
So one thing not many people know is that barrel wood, at least for professional barrels, the wood itself is actually aged. So what they do is they cut it into lumber and they literally set it outside in stacks and let the wind and the rain, the sun and the snow all affect it. And what happens is essentially at different moisture levels within the wood, different microscopic mushrooms essentially move in to the inside of the wood and change the wood on a cellular level. And then at a different moisture level, those die off and new ones move in and so on and so forth. And so the longer the wood is aged, the better it tastes, at least with oak. There may be some exceptions out there. I haven't found them yet. The limit to that is roughly 5 years. And 5-year open air seasoned wood is exponentially more expensive than 6-month open air seasoned wood, especially more so than non-open air seasoned wood at all. One, because you've got the time factor, but the longer it ages, the more the boards tend to warp and no longer, and at 5 years, that process is actually the process that degrades wood over time. So the wood actually is broken down enough to the point that it won't form a structurally sound barrel anymore. So with my product, you can go, normally after 5 years, you couldn't use it anymore. You just have to burn it or get rid of it if it didn't sell if you're a barrel manufacturer. But with staves, again, you're not making a barrel. It just has to not turn to dust, essentially. So you could use 10-year open air seasoned French oak on a wine, and we could make wine that tastes better than anything humans have ever made before with this process. Because before you were limited to 5 years, but now you can go 10, maybe even 20 years.
That's another advantage of your product is that sustainability piece of it, really.
Yeah.
Two parts of it I'm hearing. The one is that you're able to use wood that currently or previously would not be able to be used, especially in the barrel situation. So that's number one. And number two is, wow, the taste is even better.
Right.
That aging process is longer, but it would never be able to sustain a barrel structure.
Right. And it's not just that. I can use wood that a barrel manufacturer would normally have to throw away before they even start aging it. So if it's got knots or if it's not quite straight to begin with, they would just have to discard that wood as trash or burn it or something. With staves, if it's got a knot, I haven't isolated that yet because I've been getting the wood that they use from their wine barrels and stuff like that. But who knows, maybe a knotted piece of wood tastes better than a non-knotted piece of wood. So I can use non-ideal cuts. In addition, if you look at a barrel, like if you were to take a used barrel, wine or bourbon, and cut it in half so you can see the cross section of the wood in a circle, the liquid only penetrates about 1/4 of an inch or so into the actual wood. you've got all the rest of that material sitting there that essentially only serves to make a structure. So with my product, you just have to factor in the surface area of the wood and the average penetration, and you don't have any waste at all. All that extra wood that would normally just be the structure, that can be used for more staves as opposed to just wasted as a structure. So you end up using almost 4 times less wood, and it also allows you to use non-ideal wood, which would normally be trash anyway.
So you're taking advantage of the entire wood piece instead of, so the waste goes away essentially, where with the barrel waste, there's a good portion of wood that's not being utilized in that aging process. But with the staves, you can actually use that and not have the waste. That's from a sustainability standpoint, and being a good steward of our resources. We're able to utilize so much more of that raw resource that you have there. Yeah, that's really great with the zero waste, essentially.
And actually, kind of combining 2 previous points, you were talking about other woods. Another way that my processes are more sustainable for the environment is that normally when like a apple orchard or a peach orchard or something like that chops down their trees, all that wood from those trees that they cut down is essentially waste for the most part. Sometimes they find a use for it, sometimes they don't. But since I can use any wood, all those fruit orchards that are cutting down trees when they're no longer producing fruit can now be used for aging. And what I found is that any tree that produces fruit, the wood tastes amazing. So there's a whole lot more that we can do besides sticking to oak.
So from an innovation, and a future thought standpoint, Chris, I'm hearing that, I mean, you have a great product already and you have several options available on your website that I saw, but you also have a great expansion opportunity trying to, again, going back to the drawing board, essentially with some of the wood from fruit trees that is currently all waste when they're no longer able to be utilized. Your process might be able to utilize them, and you can have that as a product. That's exciting from just being able to use all the resources that we have. We have food insecurity all across the world, and people are trying to figure out how to utilize all of, especially the natural products that we produce. So something like a fruit tree, normally the fruit that comes off the tree is what's used, and then the tree itself is an afterthought, but you're going to be able to use that. And I look forward to seeing what future products you might come up with from that. What other expansion areas do you have in mind for your product?
Basically any fruit tree, unless I find out it's toxic, is definitely on the table. There's a Western red cedar, which is one of the only non-toxic cedar woods in the Northern Hemisphere of America. I found out that it's actually the traditional cooking wood of Native American tribes in the Oregon and Portland area. And so I'm going to start doing stuff with Western red cedar staves and aging beer. So especially kind of that hoppy IPA profile, I think it'll work really well.
Okay, 2 things there. Number one is, can you define what it means for wood to be non-toxic?
Some woods are not edible. So like the Eastern red cedar, you can't really use it with food. Like you shouldn't use it to make a spoon. I mean, you definitely shouldn't immerse it in alcohol and let the alcohol soak out the contents of it, because it's not healthy. But lots of trees are healthy and perfectly fine for use on food or aging and stuff like that. For the most part, any fruit tree is going to be non-toxic. There are probably some exceptions out there because nature's huge. So one shortcut that I found is that you can try to find out various woods that indigenous people in North America, it'd be Native Americans, used throughout their history to cook with. And usually if they've been using it for hundreds of years, it's probably safe.
All right. So really the toxicity of woods has kind of been studied, and there's some kind of a chemical makeup of woods that identifies it as toxic or non-toxic. So you know what to use. But then the second part of what I heard you say was beer.
Yeah.
As far as you're going outside of the bourbon to beer, and that's one area. Have you thought of others as well?
Basically any alcohol. Vodka wouldn't meet the standard of vodka anymore, but beer, tequila. I'm potentially working with a tequila distillery right now, doing something with them. Wine, basically any spirits or anything that would need to be aged, and that includes olive oil too.
Wow. Okay. That's a huge market. You've just barely touched the edge of the iceberg here. There's a whole lot still underneath the water that we can't see,
Right.
is what I'm
Yeah.
hearing from you. That's exciting. That's really exciting. And as far as, you have different kind of liquids, but what about some of these different products and supply chain and getting your raw materials? Have you had any issue with what you're currently using? You want to expand into all these markets, but what's the supply chain look like for some of that? Are you?
Like most of the fruit trees are going to be local starting out. Like there's a lot of apple orchards close to me and peach orchards close to me. The hardest ones currently that I have plans for are wood from a maple syrup producing tree, which again would also be waste when it's done. And then wood from the Western red cedar, which I have to have shipped all the way from Oregon. Actually, it's not related to those. It's related to American white oak. I just got a shipping quote for shipping it versus picking it up, and it's not halfway across the US. It's only like a quarter of the way across. And pre-pandemic, it's probably 4 times higher than it was for shipping the same amount, the same distance. So anything supply chain is going to probably take longer than usual and be much more expensive than usual.
Wow, that is, I know that there are a lot of issues in the manufacturing world. The lucky thing for you is that you have really shelf stable, for lack of a better term, but
Right.
you don't have to worry about, you don't have to like using the wood from the fruit trees locally. That's great. That's a great option. But even if you have to transport wood, you don't have like fresh fruit you're waiting on. The wood is going to be okay.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit longer to get to you. So that's a really good thing. I'm sorry about the supply chain challenges. Hopefully some of that will alleviate. The good thing for you is really sometimes when you have challenges like this, it sparks innovation. It's making you think outside of what you're currently doing to what other avenues can I explore? You've got different liquids, you've got different kinds of woods, all within your same business model that you can take advantage of to explore that. What else do you think our audience might want to know about your business and what you're doing? Because beyond barrels, you have a lot of growth opportunity.
Well, actually, my business model is a little bit different pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. Well, no, it's not post-pandemic. So before I switched, I was focusing on consumers and restaurants. Aging cocktails would help drive consumer sales. And I ended up with restaurant clients from Charleston, South Carolina to Los Angeles doing amazing things with it. So essentially you can take some cocktails and the same way you would age moonshine into bourbon, you can age the cocktail to make it even better. And they were doing some amazing, really creative stuff with it, but it didn't drive a single consumer sale. So it was a lot of work and I didn't make it. It didn't generate any money. If restaurants are still interested in it, I'll still sell to them, but I'm not going to be out pounding the pavement when I could focus on something like breweries or distilleries where I can actually generate some money.
Right. Interesting concept about the aging of the cocktails, because you have the staves for sale on your website. So I at home could essentially do the same thing, couldn't I?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Which was your initial idea. So we're going to cut out the restaurant. They're doing their own thing, and maybe they can sell the aged, the cocktails that are aged with your staves, but that wasn't driving any consumer sales. However, now that pandemic has forced you to go all online, and consumers can buy that directly.
Yep. So I figured out a while ago that using a chemical flame versus a real wood fire flame to char wood, everything I do now is toasted, just like a wine barrel. But when you get into charred wood, wood charred over a real wood fire tastes better than wood done with a torch. So before I really start scaling up and producing and selling charred staves, I'm kind of working through how to do that using a real wood fire at scale while still not wasting a ton of wood on the fire. So what I've kind of got in my head right now is kind of a modified wood pizza oven, but shrunk down, where the flame kind of goes up into a point and I can stick half in at a time, then flip it around and do the other half, or something more modified where it's a longer stave that I'm going to cut later, and it kind of spins through that opening right there where the flame's going up. So that's kind of what I'm working on conceptually right now.
Hey, that is really cool innovation. I love that. Just trying to figure out, you can do it one or two or what, by hand, but then to scale and thinking ahead about scaling that process. And I love that you're testing. Just who would have thought? The average person is not going to think, okay, it's going to taste better with a real open flame, not a torched. charring. And the fact that you have the intellect to even think along those terms and test that out and see which one is better, that's why you're in this business.
Well, thank you. It wasn't completely me. I'm going around to restaurants and stuff like that, so I get to see what the trends are in the restaurant industry. And flavor is flavor. A great chef can give me insights in their food cooking that I can also apply to what I'm doing, since it's, again, the end result of somebody's taste buds. And there's a big trend in the food industry that's been going on for a while to, instead of just using a gas chemical flame to cook food, they'll actually have real wood fires that they cook over in some high-end restaurants. So it's really cool to see that we're almost coming full circle historically. We used to cook stuff over wood fires, as cavemen and stuff like that. And we're kind of rediscovering at high-end restaurants that, hey, that actually is a really cool flavor and it tastes way better than using a chemical flame. And so they're kind of coming up with processes and stuff like that in the restaurant industry to be able to do that at scale.
Maybe those old methods, those tried and true, like you were saying, some of the indigenous peoples, the woods that they were using, they've already tried this process out, what works great, and no reason to recreate that. Just take from them the best of what they've discovered and then apply it to your business model. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being on the Future Foodcast. Such innovation, such creativity happening. And I love the sustainability piece as well of what you're able to do, just utilizing all the resources and thinking about other resources to utilize that are currently being discarded, like the fruit tree, wood from different sources. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience before we sign off?
Thank you for having me on, and it's been a pleasure talking with you.
All right. See you, Chris.
Hey, bye.
Thanks for listening to Future Foodcast. Future Foodcast is powered by Farm to Plate, the leading food blockchain platform. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date with the very latest innovations in the food industry.